All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you're all staying cool out there. We're in a heat wave, so I really do hope you're drinking water and wearing sunscreen today. I'm Sean Richardson. I'm the current Assistant Director of Alumni Relations with attention to affinity programming, and I'm glad you're able to join us for our lunch hour lecture. Um, I have the privilege of introducing our lecturer, Dr. Sharon Ann Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a professor of history and the department chair at Providence College. She specializes in the financial history of the United States with a particular interest in complex interactions between financial institutions and their clientele. Her book, Banking on Slavery, Financing Southern Expansion in the Antebellum United States, examines the relationship between commercial banks and the development of the Southern frontier during the first half of the 19th century. It is the winner of the 2023 Williams Prize in Louisiana History, winner of the 2024 Ralph Gamori Prize of the Business History Conference, and a finalist for the 2024 Hagley Prize for the Best Book in Business History. She is also the author of Investing in Life, Insurance in Antebellum America, and Other People's Money, How Banking Worked in the Early American Republic. She has also been an associate editor of Enterprise and Society, the International Journal of Business History, since 2011, and has just completed her term as president of the Business History Conference. The resume is long. The resume is excellent. So let's welcome her, and I will turn it over to her.
Great, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to this lunch hour lecture on the history of Juneteenth. And thanks to Sean Richardson for inviting me today. Now, some of you may have celebrated Juneteenth for your entire life, with traditions that have been passed on through generations of your family. Others might have an awareness of Juneteenth without much context for why it's important. And I suspect quite a few of you had never heard of Juneteenth much before it became a national holiday in 2021. So today, I'm not only going to try to explain the holiday itself, but I'm also going to put it into a much wider context to explain why it is an important national holiday for all Americans. And hopefully, no matter what your prior experience is with Juneteenth, you'll learn something new today. And so to do that, I'm going to start about a decade before the Emancipation Proclamation with a very famous speech given by Frederick Douglass. Douglass, many of you, most of you have probably heard of. He was born into slavery and then escaped as a young man, settling in Massachusetts. In 1845, he published an autobiography of his life under slavery, which became a bestseller in the North and is still widely read. Many of you probably have read it. He soon became an extremely popular speaker within the abolitionist movement. And one of his most well-known speeches was called, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And in this speech, he takes white Americans to task for violating the core ideas of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And he also questions the Christian values of people who support slavery with all its cruelty and yet call themselves Christian. And so a quote from this document, from this speech, is answering this question. I answer, what is the 4th of July? A day that reveals to him, more than all other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants brash-fronted impudence, your shout of liberty and equality hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Now, Douglass could have easily attacked the documents themselves, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the ringing words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal were, of course, written by a slaveholder. The Constitution contains clauses designed to protect the system of slavery and give outsized power to the slaveholders. But rather than attacking these documents and the founders, Douglass instead chooses to celebrate their vision. He celebrates the promise of these documents, and he calls on all Americans to see that this promise has not yet been fulfilled. Americans celebrate the 4th of July as Independence Day, and he says you should celebrate this as Independence Day. This is the day when all claim their freedom from the British. But this independence didn't apply to everyone. So the 4th of July is an extremely important day in our history, but it is incomplete, as Douglass says. By the way, if you've never read this speech in its entirety, I highly recommend it. It's a very powerful indictment of slavery on the eve of the Civil War. And less than a decade after Douglass gave this speech, the nation fought that brutal Civil War. And I want to make clear, this war was 100% about slavery. In the aftermath of the war, Southerners would go to great lengths to redefine the reasons for the war, claiming that it was about protecting states' rights rather than being about slavery. And for more than a century, this false narrative was largely accepted. If I had more time, I would dismantle this argument piece by piece, but I can say without qualification that without the existence of slavery, no Civil War would have been fought. The Southern states fought to protect their right to own slaves. The Constitution created by the Confederacy closely resembled the Constitution of the United States, with the exception that it explicitly built in protections for slavery. In a major speech given by the Confederate Vice President Alexander Hamilton Stevens, just weeks before the outbreak of the war, known as the Cornerstone Speech, Stevens said that Thomas Jefferson actually erred when he stated in the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal. He said, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and this, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." So the Confederates themselves said from the beginning that this was a war to protect the institution of slavery. But while Southerners were clearly fighting to protect the system of slavery, most Northerners were not fighting to free the enslaved people, at least not initially. Most Northerners did not really care whether or not slavery existed in the South. They did object to the further spread of slavery to the new territories of the West. They didn't want to compete with slave labor in these new areas. They did object to the ways that slaveholders tried to assert their political power within Northern states. But the reason Northerners actually fought was to protect the sanctity of the Union. The South had seceded over an election that was completely fair and constitutional. By trying to negate the results of the election, they were undermining the very principles at the core of the nation's founding. And if they succeeded in seceding, then what would stop the entire nation from fragmenting in the future if other states should disagree, if Maine decided they preferred Canada, or California wanted to break off and be its own country? So while slavery was the cause, most Northerners were fighting to preserve the Union, not to end. So how did a war about preserving the Union become a war to end slavery? Ultimately, the decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation was a tactical one. The Union had suffered a series of defeats during 1862, and Lincoln needed to find a way to change the tone of the war. If slavery was at the heart of the South's cause, then the Union should make it part of the North's cause as well. If the North won the war, yet slavery remained intact, then the conditions that led to the war would not have been resolved. As Frederick Douglass, our friend, said at the time, to fight against slaveholders without fighting against slavery is but a half-hearted business. Many Northerners also believed that the newly freed people would take up arms and help fight against the Confederacy and help change the tide of the war. So on September 22nd, 1862, 5 days after the Union victory at the brutal Battle of Antietam, Lincoln announced that all slaves still under rebel control as of January 1st, 1863, would be declared forever free. This was a direct attack at the heart of the South's cause. The proclamation rallied the support not only of Northern abolitionists, but also of other Northerners who had gradually come to view emancipation as the best way of sapping the morale and commitment of the South. It also did increase the incentive of slaves to try and escape to Union troops and join the effort to subdue the Confederacy. Blacks were now accepted into the Navy and the Army, although still in segregated units and not with equal pay. And they eventually made up 10% of Union manpower. So while it was not initially an aim of the Union war effort, the emancipation of Southern slaves absolutely helped turn the tide of the war in the Union's favor. However, there were 3 major problems with the Emancipation Proclamation. First, it only applied to enslaved people still under Confederate control. This meant that enslaved people living in states that supported the Union were not freed. So our border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, West Virginia, Delaware, those slaves are not freed. And actually, little known, it's not shown on this map, there were still slaves in parts of the North. Some states such as New Jersey had gradual abolition laws. New Jersey still had some slaves at the time of the Civil War. So those slaves were not touched either. It also did not touch the areas that were under Union control by this point. So the Union Army controlled Tennessee, shown there in blue. It controlled New Orleans and parts of southeastern Louisiana, and it controlled parts of southeastern Virginia. So the slaves in all of these areas were not affected by the proclamation. About a quarter of all enslaved people were not included. The second problem was that there's no way to enforce it in the other parts of the Confederacy that are not under Union control. As enslaved people learned of the proclamation, they could choose to abandon their plantations and join the Union, and many of them did. Many enslaved people flocked to different regiments, and initially the Union Army had a hard time trying to figure out how to deal with all these people flocking to them. Others would learn of the proclamation after Union victories and Union troops came through and took control of an area. One particularly rich abolitionist printed up 1 million copies of the proclamation in pamphlet form, and he shipped these pamphlets to the Union Army at the front. And so not only did this inform the Army of the proclamation, but it enabled these soldiers to spread the news by distributing these pamphlets to enslaved people as they encountered them throughout the South. But where the Confederacy remained strong, the proclamation had little power. Texas, for example, experienced very little fighting during the Civil War, and almost no major presence of the Union Army. So the word didn't get to Texas of the Emancipation Proclamation. Indeed, many slaveholders in the South actually migrated to Texas with their enslaved people during the war, trying to escape the Union soldiers and thinking that that would be a place where they could reestablish themselves as slaveholders. So that's the second problem. Finally, Lincoln issued the proclamation as a war measure. This was a presidential proclamation, and it was unclear if it would have any legal standing once the war was over. Thus, Lincoln decided that making the emancipation permanent through a constitutional amendment was essential. He made this a major part of his reelection campaign in 1864, which was actually quite a close campaign. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was passed then after his reelection in January of 1865, and it would be ratified in December of 1865. And this is an extremely short amendment. It merely states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This statement abolishing slavery was also the first direct mention of slavery in the Constitution. All the other references to slavery in the document had been through euphemisms that avoided the direct mention of slavery. So this is the first time that the Constitution acknowledges the problem of slavery in the United States. And as an additional aside, the caveat in there about the punishment for a crime being an acceptable reason for slavery turns out to be extremely consequential down to the present day. If you've seen or heard of the documentary The 13th, which is available on Netflix, this does a great job of unpacking the modern implications of that particular statement. But let's return to the second problem. The idea that the proclamation could not be enforced in Confederate-controlled areas. On April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered, and the Civil War was technically over. But portions of the Confederacy continued to fight. Indeed, Lincoln's going to be assassinated 5 days later, and there are attempts made as well on his Secretary of State and others by Confederate sympathizers, making it very clear that many people did not believe this war was over yet. And in many corners of the Confederacy, such as in Texas, slaveholders continued to hold people in bondage and refused to tell their enslaved people either that the Confederacy had lost the war or that the president had declared them to now be free. And so when the Union Army arrived on Galveston Island off the coast, it's just near Houston off the coast of Texas, on June 19th, 1865, 2 full months after Lee's surrender, people did not know about what had happened. And the general in charge, General Gordon Granger, issued several orders regarding the governance of the region. And one of these was General Order Number 3, which directly addressed the enslaved population. Now, there's no firm evidence of how this order was initially disseminated, but a widely held myth, and it probably is a myth, but still very popular, says that General Granger himself stood on the balcony of this villa here, Ashton Villa, which was Union Army, and it's in the center of town. And he got up on the balcony and he read the order out loud himself. And it said, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, from the president, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. Now, the story goes that he gave this order and people just were flabbergasted by the news. What? The slaves are free, and the slaves who were there just kind of absorbed the shock of this message. And after issuing this order, copies of it were printed and distributed throughout the state. It's a little fuzzy here, but you can see this handwritten copy of General Order number 3. And this was distributed. Most of the population of Texas lived on the eastern seaboard, so they didn't have to go too far inland. But this was printed and distributed, and word quickly spread from plantation to plantation that slavery was indeed over, and that the 250,000 Blacks living in Texas were now free. The newly freed people began migrating to the cities or establishing their own freedmen's towns, as they called them. So although Lincoln had given the Emancipation Proclamation almost 3 years earlier, and although ratification of the 13th Amendment was still several months away, June 19th, 1865, symbolically became the moment when the last of the enslaved people learned of their freedom. America's second Independence Day, when the words of the Declaration of Independence finally began to be applied, even if still imperfectly, to the entire nation. The following year, in 1866, Blacks in Galveston gathered on June 19th to celebrate the day they associated with their freedom, starting the tradition that eventually led to the national holiday. And it was initially known as Emancipation Day or Jubilee Day, but eventually it came just to be called Juneteenth. Now, throughout the South, there are actually many different Emancipation Days. So in places like New Orleans, they had their own day that they, when they first learned of the Emancipation Proclamation, that they would celebrate. And other parts of the South each had their own day of Jubilee or Emancipation Day. But over time, it kind of codified around Juneteenth as being that day when the last of the slaves were notified, even though, again, it took several weeks, even months for it to get throughout Texas. Now, as with the celebration of the 4th of July, the celebration of Juneteenth has evolved very much over the years. Initially, the celebrations were often based in Black churches, which were one of the few places where Blacks could gather freely. And so there's often prayer services involved and remembrances, and there's some, mix of, is this a celebration? Is this more memorial? Remembering the hard times of slavery. It's kind of a mix of both joy and sadness that comes together here. In some communities, though, Blacks decided to pool their money together to start purchasing land specifically designated as a place to celebrate the holiday. And so, for example, Blacks in Houston purchased land in 1872. So this is only 7 years after the end of the war. And so remember, all these slaves have been freed, but they've basically been, there was approximately 4 million enslaved people in the South who were given their freedom and nothing else. They were basically told to figure it out. They weren't given back wages, they weren't given land, they weren't given resources. The Freedmen's Bureau came down to try to help establish some schools and try to help them with get their feet off the ground. But for the most part, they were pretty much told to just figure it out on their own. So the fact that in a mere 7 years, you had people who had pulled together enough money to purchase 10 acres of land is pretty significant. And the purpose of this land was specifically to use it to celebrate Emancipation Day, Juneteenth. And this is still today the oldest park in the city of Houston. This picture here is a very early picture from the 1880s of Juneteenth being celebrated in Emancipation Park. And I believe this is from 21. Maybe 2022, a celebration of Emancipation Day today in that same park. The park was eventually turned over to the city of Houston and is now a public park there, but it's still called Emancipation Park. And a couple of other places this also happened. Austin, people purchased land. Other parts of the South, people purchased land to celebrate these events. And these annual events were both an opportunity to celebrate freedom, as well as a way to push back against the ongoing racism in the aftermath of the war. It was also a way to inform people of their rights, to educate people how to vote, how do you register to vote, how do you go about doing it, all these types of things. So it served multiple purposes. The Black community would hold parades and with song and celebration, followed by massive community feasts. So here we have 1900 Emancipation Day in Austin. And you can see the band there playing, and again, they're with the American flag in the background, celebrating. This is an American celebration of independence here. These celebrations might include prayer services, as I said, barbecues, food became a really important part of this. I'll talk about that a little more in a couple minutes. Picnics, beauty pageants, baseball games, anything you can imagine. You can see here, this is Richmond in 1905, a large parade through the streets. And notice everybody gets dressed up in their finest outfits. This is a really important day to celebrate. And here we have 1906, a parade, and you have floats, and you have decorated buggy here in Houston celebrating these events. Now, as we get towards the First World War, Blacks began migrating to the north. They're migrating out of Texas, and they're migrating to other parts of the country. And they brought these Juneteenth traditions to other parts of the country, where they often merged with the other emancipation celebrations in these other places. But the Juneteenth celebration just seemed to have the most cogency. At the same time, though, we also have the emergence in the late 19th century of the Ku Klux Klan. And we have the emergence of Jim Crow laws that back on the rights of Blacks throughout the country, but particularly in the South. And because of this, especially because of the violence attached to the Ku Klux Klan this time period, many of these celebrations started to become more muted. And I'm seeing my internet connections unstable. I hope I'm not having trouble here. But these celebrations began to be forced underground as some people were concerned about the safety, concerned about them becoming targets. And so while these celebrations continued, they often became smaller, often became more within families and small communities. And as you can, oops, sorry, here's I always forget my slides. My students always laugh at me. Here's just 1922 and St. Parade through the town here. But this is what I was trying to get to. This is just a chart, one chart to kind of demonstrate the rise of white supremacy that's occurring in this period. This is the date of the creation of different Confederate monuments and the naming of schools against Confederate leaders and other symbols of the Confederacy. And you can see from the dates here that it's really starting in the late 1880s and then rising at the turn of the century that we see that the celebration of the Confederacy, this pushback against the Civil War, is occurring. And it's at this time that Southerners are trying to rewrite both the history of the war itself and the history of the period before the war, what's as the lost cause. This is also when the Confederate flag came into popular use. And I can give you a whole long history of the Confederate flag and why it is not a symbol of Southern heritage. But that's another lecture. This is also when popular accounts of the South, such as the movie Gone with the Wind, tried to recast Southern life and make it seem like enslaved people were not only content during the antebellum period, but they were actually better off during slavery. So this is a really important period where the story is being recast. And so the celebrations of Juneteenth are butting up against this reimagining of American history. And Gary Gallagher explains the lost cause in this way. The architects of the lost cause acted from various motives. They collectively sought to justify their own actions and allow themselves and other former Confederates to find something positive in an all-encompassing failure. They also wanted to provide their children and future generations of white Southerners with a correct narrative of the war. And so this lost cause narrative actually came to dominate the history of the period, and people really bought into this idea, the War of Northern Aggression. I have to say, I went to undergrad in Virginia in the 1990s. And coming from New Jersey, I had never heard the term War of Northern Aggression. I had no idea about this lost cause mentality and did not realize how ingrained it actually was in the South still at the end of the 20th century. So this is a really powerful narrative that really dominated the thought process, and as the celebration of the things like the Confederate flag and the current debate over Confederate monuments attest, this is an ongoing conversation. But the Juneteenth celebrations continued, even if they were smaller and more muted. And during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, Blacks again began asserting their right to celebrate Juneteenth publicly and to make it a big celebration that everybody should be embracing. Amazingly, it's actually Texas that is the first state to declare Juneteenth as a state holiday in 1979. We first celebrated in 1980. And then by the 1980s, we start seeing major Juneteenth celebrations again in various cities. Oops, sorry, I'm forgetting my pictures again. Here's just a smaller community celebration of Juneteenth in the 1950s. But here in the 1980s, here's Seattle, their first annual Juneteenth celebration taking place in 1980, and people at a Juneteenth concert in the 1980s. So we start seeing these celebrations emerging, still not more popular within Black communities, still not breaking out into the wider national realm, but they are emerging. And you start seeing some states even by 2020, Virginia, New Jersey, New York, declaring it a state holiday, at least. But it's only when we get to 2020 that we start, and I should say, from the beginning, there were people pushing to make this a national holiday. The quest to make this a national holiday has been ongoing for a really, really long time. But it was only in 2020, in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and the other horrific events, Breonna Taylor, and those other events of the summer of 2020, the widespread protests of the racial problems in this country that went on throughout the summer of 2020, that the idea of Juneteenth being an important national holiday kind of really rose to the surface finally. And it got its final push. And then on June 17th, 2021, President Biden signed the bill that finally made it a federal holiday. And it was celebrated for the first time just 2 days later on June 19th, 2021. But while Juneteenth celebrations take place throughout the country and take various forms throughout the country, Galveston still remains the heart of the holiday, similar to the association of Philadelphia with the Declaration of Independence. You have people who go back to Galveston, make a pilgrimage to Galveston to kind of experience Juneteenth in its original place. And in Galveston, each year, a reenactor dressed as General Granger stands on that same balcony of the Ashton Villa and reads the general order. Again, whether or not General Granger ever actually did this in reality is very much in question, but this is how they celebrate it. While the people below take in the message as if they're hearing it for the first time, that all slaves are now free. And then sorts of other big celebrations throughout Galveston, with again the prayer breakfast and the parades and different types of celebrations to incorporate it. And another common tradition across many Juneteenth celebrations is food. And Sean started when he first asked me, he said, "Can you talk about food in Juneteenth?" And I said, "I don't know that I could talk for very long about food on Juneteenth, but I can talk a little about food." So Juneteenth celebrate all the many contributions of African Americans to the American food tradition. And certainly, the Southern food culture is very much related to African American food traditions, things like gumbo and okra and all sorts of foods that came from Africa or incorporated with African ingredients. But specifically, red foods are associated with Juneteenth. And it's the idea of remembering all the sacrifice and the bloodshed of their enslaved ancestors. So we have barbecued ribs. Okay, they're kind of semi-red, but other red meats are included. But then you have things like watermelon and red velvet cake, red rice, strawberry soda, fruit punch, red Kool-Aid. These are all regular parts of Juneteenth menus. And so kind of embracing this, having fun with the color red. Also, sometimes they'll make it a red, green, and black kind of menu where you're bringing in the three colors of the traditional Pan-African flag, but red is really what's most associated with it. And then music is another really important through line for these celebrations. From the parades and the bands, music is really central. And there are many, many songs associated with Juneteenth, but the most well-known is probably Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is also known as the Black National Anthem. The poet James Weldon Johnson wrote the words to the song in 1900, and his brother then set the poem to music that same year. So it was right away intended to be a musical poem. And in recent years, this song has been actually included as part of the opening of the Super Bowl. So if you are paying attention at the very beginning, when they do all those opening America the Beautiful and the Star Spangled Banner, they've also had the Black National Anthem there, Lift Every Voice and Sing, as well. And so one of my favorite versions of the song was performed by Alicia Keys in 2021 for the Super Bowl. And I'd like to play that for you as I end.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the glistening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Let us march on till victory is won. Let us march on till victory.
So that just gives you chills. I hope it gave you chills. So that's where I'd like to end. I hope that all of you have learned something from this. I hope this has helped you understand a little bit more about why Juneteenth is so important, not just as an African-American holiday, but as an American holiday, and why it should be in its rightful place as a national holiday. And I think we have plenty of time for some Q&A, so I'm happy to do that. I'm going to stop sharing here. Okay.
Yes, Dr. Murphy, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for your words and your time, and also sharing the Black National Anthem. That's something that I like. A lot of people do not necessarily know that that is the Black National Anthem. So thank you for sharing that. We will now move into the Q&A section of the lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A box right here. We got a question that says, should we alter how we celebrate the 4th of July?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think, going back to Frederick Douglass and his, I think he's right that the original documents and the reasons we celebrate the 4th of July are correct. And it's the promise of the documents is a correct one. We just fell short for a really long time, and we can argue we're still falling short in many ways. So I don't know that we need to alter how we celebrate the 4th of July. I think, recognizing that there's more to the story, and that I always tell my students, don't look at historical figures as heroes or villains, because the minute you do that, it becomes problematic. The minute you try to say, well, is Thomas Jefferson a hero or villain? He's a person, and he's complicated, and he wrote these, amazing documents that are so important to our country. And he was a slaveholder, and he fathered children with a slave and enslaved his own children. I mean, he's a complicated person, and so we need to be able to do both. And I think, celebrating the 4th of July and the promise of the Declaration of Independence is really important. But also recognizing its shortcomings is also important. And so having Juneteenth there, I think, it doesn't need to be a competing holiday. I think they're both important, just like we have other national holidays that serve other roles. So that's just my personal opinion, but I think it's not about changing the 4th of July, but recognizing that Juneteenth is just as important. It's not unimportant. It's not a secondary holiday. It's not just for certain Americans. It's a really important holiday in its own right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We have another question that says, what would you recommend as good further reading off of what you mentioned in the webinar?
So a couple of things. One thing is there's a book called On Juneteenth, which actually tells you very little about Juneteenth. But so it's a little deceptive, but it's written by Annette Gordon-Reed, who's a very prominent historian. And it talks about she grew up in Texas, she was born in Texas. And it talks about her experiences growing up in Texas and related to Juneteenth and her experiences with that. So it doesn't tell you as much about Juneteenth as you might like, but it is really a wonderful read. The other thing I would recommend is a book by Clint Smith called How the Word is Passed. And the whole book is wonderful. I actually assign it to my Civ students now. It came out in 2020, 2020, I believe. He has a whole chapter in there on Galveston Island and talking about the reenactment that occurs. So I talked very briefly about that reenactment. He attends the reenactment and talks about it. The whole book, though, is wonderful. He talks about the purpose of the book is how we remember slavery in this country, how we remember the events about it. So he goes to the Whitney plantation in Louisiana, which is just a fabulous plantation that focuses on the experience of the enslaved people. He talks about New York and the experience of enslaved people in New York. He goes to a Confederate Memorial Day celebration in Virginia. And so the whole book is great, but he does have a wonderful chapter in there on just how Galveston Island currently celebrates Juneteenth as well. So those are the two things right off the top of my head I would recommend.
Thank you for that. I was also thinking of the 13th.
Yes.
That's also such a great documentary to watch. You mentioned it earlier in your lecture, so I just wanted to bring that back up.
And there's the 13th is a great documentary, and then there's also Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow, which I also teach in Civ. Civ has probably changed a lot from when all of you were took Civ, but that also talks a lot about the implications of the 13th Amendment. But if you want the Netflix version, also does a really good job with that.
Yeah. We have a question about learning more about Rhode Island's history in the slave trade. Is there any recommendations you can provide or any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there is a recent book on Rhode Island and the slave trade. I reviewed it. I was a little mixed about how good it is, but it does give a good background. Trying to remember the title of the book off the top of my head. I know there's a couple of great books coming out about the North and slavery. So there's a professor at Brown who has a book coming out next year, actually. His name's Seth Rockman, and he's talking about the involvement of Northern material culture. So Northerners making the shovels and the clothing and everything that's so important, and shipping them down south, and their involvement with like just making what the plantations need to survive. So there is some stuff out there. I can't remember. I'm blanking on the name of the other book though, that's specifically on Rhode Island slavery though. Let me see the next.
Yeah. Someone is asking if you could touch on your book, Banking on Slavery, and how banks were complicit in slavery as well.
Yeah, so I'll try to make this a short answer because it's a long book, but the book is really looking at specifically in the areas of the Southwest, so Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Southwestern Georgia, where the slavery was really expanding during the 1820s and 30s. And looking at the role that banks played in enabling that spread of slavery. So banks were actually very conservative institutions. Most banks in places like Virginia and North Carolina had very relatively limited direct involvement with slavery. They had a lot of indirect involvement, but limited direct involvement. But I'm looking at these banks that actually became essential to the movement of slavery and the domestic slave trade into these regions, and establishing these large sugar plantations and cotton plantations in these new emergence areas of the South, specifically in the 1820s and 1830s. Most of these banks, though, no longer exist in our current banking system. For the most part, is not a direct descendant of these banks. So there's not as much direct connection with how we currently do banking and that system. But I look at why the financial system was so important to the domestic slave trade at the time. Why do I think New Jersey? So the question, why Rhode Island waited until 2024 to make Juneteenth a state holiday? Most states did. I think very few states had it as a state holiday before that. I think, well, I don't know. I guess after 2021, some states got quicker with it. You know, it there's all sorts of implications of making something a holiday. You know, it became a federal holiday. There was no mail yesterday. It became a state holiday. You know, it's giving people off from work, and you know, so there's implications that have to be taken into consideration for different states. You know, I think a lot of it is just I will say lack of knowledge about the holiday, and that, you know, really for most people it was probably came out of nowhere, or seemed to come out of nowhere when it got passed, or 2020 may have been the first time they really started hearing about these celebrations. So and that's true for blacks and whites. You know, blacks growing up in northern communities that don't have as large a African American population may not have really celebrated it much themselves either. So I think a lot of it's just it's a new concept, and Rhode Island's always the last to sign on to stuff. I mean, that's just historically true. So let's see. Um, Oh, sure. Oh, yes, absolutely. So the question is there any anecdotal evidence that slaves from various populations were either resistant or hesitant about embracing the Emancipation Proclamation due to simply fear of the unknown? Absolutely. You know, just try to place yourself in this position where your people have been enslaved for generations. This is what you've been told. You've been told your whole life that this is who you are, what you should be. This is the normal, natural way of things. And you are suddenly then told you are free. Do you believe that? You know, is there going to be repercussions? Is someone going to suddenly say, oh, just kidding, we tricked you, now we're going to punish you for your impudence, for not being loyal? So there's that fear, and there's also the fear of, well, what do I do now? I mean, again, they're not being given anything. They're not being given, you know, there's no here's some money to start up cash, here's a piece of land, you know, the promise of 40 acres and a mule never materialized. And so there is this question of, you know, well, I need to support my family. I need to feed them. Maybe I should just stay here and work for the same guy who, you know, held me enslaved. At least that is giving me a minimum to feed my family. So sure, yeah, there was definitely resistance. I think what's more shocking is how many people jumped at it despite the fact that there was no safety net, so to speak, and said, hell yeah, we're going to just go and figure it out, and we're just so happy to be freed. And so you know, I almost would expect more people to have been reluctant actually were. And there were you know, there were millions of people were displaced before the war due to the domestic slave trade. Families separated, parents separated from children, wives separated from husbands. So one of the things you see immediately after the Civil War is blacks wandering throughout the South, trying desperately to find their family members. And you see, if you look at the newspapers of the time, people putting in newspaper advertisements, have you seen my daughter Tilly? She was 2 when she was taken from me. I'm not sure where she was taken. And they don't know the location. They don't have a last name. They haven't seen them in 30 years. And they are trying to find them anyway. You have, you know, literally hundreds and hundreds of people having mass weddings because enslaved people weren't allowed to marry. And so you have them, you know, just having these mass weddings, even though they had been living together as husband and wife, you know, trying to, you know, legally solidify the marriage. These mass weddings are occurring. And so to me, in some ways, it's the opposite is what's more surprising, that they so easily just jumped at the chance to be free, even though they had no safety net, even though they didn't have an education. Most of them were uneducated, most of them were illiterate, most of them didn't have skills. Some did, but most did not. And yet they still said, freedom is more important than anything else. Finding my family, getting my family back intact is more important than anything else. But yes, there certainly were people who were like, I don't know what to do. Maybe staying put is the best way to start. That was a long-winded answer.
Thank you everyone for attending the lunch hour lecture. Thank you, Dr. Sharon Murphy, for your thoughts and your expertise and your wisdom on this. I'm super grateful to have learned, and I'm grateful to have engaged with you all in this way. Once again, let's thank Dr. Sharon Murphy for her insight into the history of Juneteenth. And I hope to see you all soon. And stay cool. Thank you again for attending.